I do believe so. So, for example, today I was walking in Berlin, and it felt like a very open space. So compared to the experience that I have in our city, Athens, it was very not urban. In Athens, because space is more dense, so in simple words, streets are narrower, buildings are not higher, but just closer together, and there's balconies, and there's always life and activity visible. Walking in the city isn't that different to being inside a house and looking at people in the kitchen or the living room. It's a much more intense social experience. And of course it has a lot to do with the climate, because today was so cold, for example. But it's not just about the climate, it has to do with the way that the city is built. Maybe the places, because I'm a visitor, I don't want to say tourist, but basically I'm a tourist in Berlin. Maybe the places I walked happened to be, maybe touristy or big streets and things like that. But I think there is a different way of thinking about the space in the two cities, and in Greece, as in probably in many Mediterranean cities, social life is easier to happen because of the way it's designed. So, well, we are young architects. We started the office 10 years ago, and so that's about when the economic crisis started to develop. In other words, we know that we're probably not going to be able to literally change the city. So it's not in our hands, it's not in our power. So for that reason, we have focused our work more into changing the way that we think about the city. Because a city is not just what it is, it's also what we think it to be, right? Like anything else. So that's something that can happen by just manipulating or influencing minds. It's about ideas. So that's something that doesn't cost anything. So maybe it wasn't even a conscious decision that we did that, but it kind of happened naturally. So if you don't have money, what do? You use ideas which are free. You just develop them. So to be more specific in our work, we try to observe public space as it is, understand what's good about it, or what potential there is, without making big transformations and things like that, and to try to reveal that, to show it, to communicate it. So I think that the most significant part of our work, at least concerning public space, has to do with that, has to do with influencing the way that people think about it. And that has a lot of, I could go on forever, but I'll stop soon. But it has a lot of sides to it, because sometimes it's as simple as bringing love to a place, to a public space. For example, there's a project that we did, I'll show it tonight, where we basically didn't propose very much. It was more about putting attention on a place. And of course, there was an intervention, but the intervention was more of a trick to get you to look at it longer. Because it's not easy to do, eh? It's not an obvious thing how you do it. You cannot just make a photograph of a square and ask people to look at it. You have to invent a mechanism that will keep the minds of the people focused on it. I think that aesthetics and motivation, in the way that you kind of mean them, I suppose, I think they're not that different, first of all, because at least they shouldn't be, right? Because aesthetics, the interesting thing about aesthetics is not, a discussion about what's beautiful and what's not. It's aesthetics is a cultural thing. If you think about it, there's a reason why things are considered nice or not, correct? And that's something cultural, historical. It grows in time. So The interesting thing that I find in what you're describing in your question is that is to think that the elements that we use in the collages, for example, that you mentioned, of course they aim into a specific motivation, so a goal, but at the same time it coincides with different aesthetics, because the different aesthetics are addressing a different motivation. That's what's so fascinating. So of course it's not a matter of aesthetics in that simple way. It's not a matter of making something beautiful, for example, or a beautiful combination. I wouldn't even know how to think like that. I think that's such a difficult discussion, aesthetics, for example, right? While I think it's much more, not easy, but it's much more, I think it's more manageable to decide what you want to do and then try to find the pieces, as you say, that will get you to that direction. So that's the motivation, I think you called it. But the interesting thing is that aesthetics happens automatically, because motivation and elements will carry their own world and their own aesthetics with them. Yeah, I'm surprised about your question. At first I was surprised about your question, but then I realized that there's a connection between these things that you distinguish, and then you bring also communication, and indeed communication is also part of it. I'll give you an example, because I believe in our office actually we believe in examples. So whenever there's a question that maybe is a bit difficult or theoretical, we just jump into examples. And then communication happens differently. So, for example, when we do, let's forget about public space for a moment and urban projects, and let's think of just a small interior project. We never know how to choose, for example, materials based on taste or aesthetics. We never know what's nice next to something else. Because to me, everything can be nice. It's so many options, right? So we try to decide on these kind of things, for example, materials, by deciding what it means. And I'm not talking philosophically, but what effect it has to you to bring, for example, stones next to tiles, which is an image in the poster for the lecture. So it does something to your mind. So there's the motivation. For example, in the poster image, it's a house. I'm going to talk about it later. It's a house where it was a lot about promoting the social life of the house. So putting that first and kind of putting to the side the more private part of the life of the family. And also it was a lot about bringing the exterior space inside. So for that motivation, for that goal, like you call it, we decided to bring stones pieces, with the ones that are typically used in gardens, so exterior spaces in Greece. We brought them in the house to blur the moment that, you know, the borderline is between out and in. So we chose the stone that was the most typical in this kind of use. And not because we thought it was the most beautiful, not at all. So when we went to choose the stones, there were really beautiful stones, but we chose the cheap, ordinary one, because the motivation was then gonna be more clear, you see? So the message was gonna be clear. While if we chose based on aesthetics and we took the beautiful stone, then everybody would be attracted by the beauty and would just think, wow, that's a beautiful stone. Which is not the motivation we had. We wouldn't be interested in having that discussion or to having that effect.